Well, good evening again. Can people hear me in the back now? Yeah. All right, good. First of all, let me thank ORF and MEA for pulling this Raisina Dialogue out. I think it's been a couple of years, extraordinary job in tough times, so congrats to all of you. I've been given about an hour. They said we can stretch it about hour 15. We'll see how it goes. We'll get a conversation going here for the first 45 minutes, and then I'm told that we have to throw it open, the questions to the audience. The young fellows will get the preference in questions, so we've been told for at least 15 minutes and maybe another 15, so it'll be that's the way we'll do it. And when people ask questions, they can just say their name and affiliation and ask the question. And I'm told that to tell you no comments, please, just brief questions. So with that stuff out, we'll get into conversation of the topic. We're supposed to talk about supply chains. And in some ways, let's just pick it up from the opening session. I thought the President of the European Commission said it well and strongly that this is a defining moment which will shape decades to come. And if you look at the literature and what people are talking about, I think at least in the transatlantic ways, they are drawing parallels between what's happening in Ukraine crisis and an earlier phase of the death and demise of the first wave of globalization, which was at the height of the Edwardian England, and the first wave of globalization met its death on the battlefields of Somme. And at that time, the most prevailing thing that was being talked about in Edwardian England was that the world was so interconnected that nobody expected war to come. How would you fight because you're economically interdependent? The same argument that we hear today. The folks are then saying the second wave of globalization may very well find its demise in the battle for Kiev or for Ukraine broadly. And the question now is, how is the world going to react to this? Are they going to react the way they reacted after the First World War, where they withdrew from the world and led to a basically beggar your neighbor sort of a view that ended up into what happened in the Second World War, or you would take a more enlightened view as they did after World War II in coming up with so-called rule-based international order that you heard so much. And that's an interesting parallel, and if you read, I think there's some fascinating articles on that end. And you can already see the trend in which that trade as part of global GDP as a percentage has sort of started declining over the last few years. And even before Ukraine, you had the two largest economies, both I think leaders in China and in the United States, very actively interested in decoupling with each other. One could argue that one talks more and the other one is doing more about it. I'll let you figure out which one is which, but nonetheless, it's remarkable that both countries are interested in decoupling with each other. And the other fascinating element was that before Ukraine, we were talking about supply chains, which was largely a term came up in discussion with new technologies. When you said supply chain, they were talking about whether it be semiconductors, whether it be some other intermediate parts in the new technology. Now we talk a lot about critical minerals in the electric vehicle, battery manufacturing, so things of that kind. Then Ukraine happens, and supply chains become much more basic and much more real. So then you're talking about energy in the case of Europe. You're talking food security, supply chains, very fundamental for most of the world in Africa and Europe in particular. And then you're talking about defense supplies and armaments in case of India and its reliance on Russia. So all of a sudden, supply chains which were pretty interesting and engaging before Ukraine have become even more basic and part of sort of human beings, both our life existence but also the basic economic drivers. So in this particular context, it'd be worthwhile now to discuss, and I'll open this question and go around with specific questions to the colleagues here, whether we talk about supply chains as we have till this time in an individual sector or individual part, and then say how I work around this, whether it be a particular semiconductor discussion, whether it be critical minerals, or should we be talking about in a broader sort of reworking of a global trusted economic architecture or global trusted trade architecture? A recent speech that was given by Janet Yellen, which I don't know if you people have had a chance to look at it. And so she, I thought, was uncharacteristically bold in speaking on these matters, as most finance ministers tend to be circumspect or have been for the last 5-10 years. To say that the contours of the global economy have forever changed, and now we have to come up with what the new version would look like. She also called for a new Bretton Woods discussion to be had. But in the question of trade and supply chain, she particularly mentioned that going forward we'll have to talk about and really consider secure and reliable trade amongst partners that you can count on. So in some way, a kind of a basic definition of a trusted trade network is to trading among partners which have a common sense of commitment to certain core values, and as a result of that you can count on, I think, whichever version that it takes. And then new word has been sort of added to the trading literature called plurilateral agreements. So supposedly you got bilateral and you got multilateral, and then in between you have a subset of folks that can come and talk about trade, and that's a plurilateral agreement. One more thing and I'll get to the question on this. So everybody, and including Janet Yellen, said, one of the things going forward we'll have to look at plurilateral agreements amongst people you can count on. You've got few trade people here, and whoever's been in the trading discussion, this is nothing new. This is a repeat of the discussion that was held after Bretton Woods, where it failed to have a World International Trade Organization. Started off the Uruguay round, ended up with GATT, then came up with WTO. That was the idea that we will not do regional trades, we will not do bilateral trade, but that the global trading framework was the way to go. And even before China and Ukraine, aware of the institutional failings of WTO, big economy had moved to regional blocks, whether it be TTIP on Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership or TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. So they were put to hold because of the sort of, I think, somewhat populist anti-trade sentiments, largely in transatlantic phase, both in Europe and America, while TPP continued and Indo-Pacific as a robust trading mechanism. And supply chain was often used as a euphemistic discussion in place of trade by politicians, and it still does. So as we talk about supply chains, it'd be interesting to see how panels think, how efficient is this idea of looking at it sector by sector. Should we look at a more systemic thing at the same time in a trade? Just to think about it, if I did supply chain for every important sector, how exactly is going to work overlapping with each other? All these are sort of fascinating discussion, both in a rhetoric way, but more importantly in an actual real way to think about these things. And you also have this argument of self-sufficiency that has come up. Every country now wants to have its own semiconductor industry and completely be self-sufficient. Similar arguments we used to hear a lot about food security in the old days. Every country has to be food secure. So now the US wants to be semiconductor sufficient, France wants to be, Europe wants to be, India wants to be. Any basic modicum of economics, or at least trade economics, would say that economies of scales would point to slightly different trajectory than this self-sufficiency in technology argument that is going on. So with all that said, we'll open it up and see where we go in this broad discussion. Let me first start with the former Prime Minister, Tony Abbott. He, I think if I've heard you right, you said the AUKUS was the most substantive and meaningful agreement done in your lifetime by Australia. So Australia certainly is talking about a plurilateral agreement in building, in this case, between the three nations, nuclear submarine technology and production. That's the one way to look at it. You also have Quad work going on, and you have several FTAs. So it'd be great to hear from Australian perspective, one, how do you see supply chains both in any particular sensitive sector, but even broadly, even the agriculture and energy sector being a big player in the region, both, I think, globally, but also in the Indo-Pacific context. Appreciate your thoughts.
Okay, well, thank you, Kaush. I think I have quite a bit of standing to talk about trade because I was the Prime Minister who finalised our trade deal with China, the biggest deal China had ever done, and the only deal China had done at that stage with another G20 country. Then with Japan and with Korea. I'm currently an advisor to the British Board of Trade, and I have been an Australian trade envoy to India. And as you may know, we've just done a deal with India, which is India's biggest ever deal. And I think it is a very important deal in terms of providing an economic complement to the Quad. So I am very much a practical free trader, and I believe that freer trade is vastly for the good of the world. And if you look at the world until very recently, it has never been more free, more safe, and more rich than it was in, say, the end of 2019 before the pandemic hit and our current difficulties arose. And why was that? It was because, essentially, of globalisation. Now, the problem with globalisation, you've alluded to this, Kaush, is that it has been substantially driven by China. Chinese manufacturing at scale, at quality, and at price has transformed the global economy in the last 2 or 3 decades, and it's undeniably been good for everyone. 500 million Chinese have moved from the third world to the middle class in scarcely a generation. The world has been flooded with high quality, life-enhancing consumer goods, and countries like Australia have prospered mightily given the iron ore, the gas, the coal, etc. that we've exported to China to drive all of this. The problem is that while we see trade as a free and fair exchange between willing participants, China sees trade as a way of strengthening it for its geopolitical objectives and is more than prepared to weaponise trade where it suits them. We discovered this very much to our cost, starting about 3 years ago when we passed some laws on political interference in our domestic system, which China quite rightly interpreted as targeted at them. And as a result, we started to become subject to capricious trade boycotts that were justified on spurious quarantine and other grounds, quality grounds, but were effectively a form of political punishment for us for doing what they didn't like. Even though our two-way trade is still something like $200 billion a year, absolutely gargantuan, something like $20 billion of that trade has at different times been subject to arbitrary interruption. So the bottom line is we cannot be dependent on China for anything that we absolutely depend upon. anything that we really need? And this is the question that every country is now asking itself, partly because of China's weaponisation of trade, partly because of the supply chain disruptions and the panicky restrictions on exports that different countries have put in place as part of the pandemic. I think every country has to ask itself, what is it that is so important to us that we have to be able to do it ourselves, or we have to have a substantial domestic stockpile? What is it which is important but we are prepared to rely on our friends for? And what is it that we can at a pinch live without and we're prepared to depend on the wider world for? I think every country is asking themselves that question. Each country will come to its own answer, but nevertheless I think it is important, because at a pinch we cannot afford to be dependent on a country that might become, at a moment's notice, our bitter foe. Look at what the Ukrainians have just discovered with the Russians. Look at what the Taiwanese might find one morning with China. And of course, what's happening between Russia and Ukraine could readily enough, depending upon how circumstances unfold, then take place between Russia and other countries, maybe between Russia and NATO. So it is suddenly a different world to the world where we assumed that there was basically peace and goodwill, at least between sophisticated countries. I still believe that free trade is very important, and I am more than happy to see freer trade between my country and like-minded countries under the rule of law. But I think these are critical distinctions. We cannot have dependency on countries that might ruthlessly exploit that dependency for their own benefit and to our long-term strategic cost. What does that mean? It means, frankly, that we will be less rich, but we will also be more safe, and I would say more free.
Let me come to you, Shamika, Ravi, Vice President of Economic Policy at ORF. One of the important issues, as the Prime Minister mentioned in trade, is that largely the globalization, so to speak, that has happened. One could argue that it's been led by business in some ways, a multinational, and the idea of economic interest or national interest, everybody says, including Janet Yellen in her speech, that national interest would have more bearing, not necessarily, it's not a start of it, but more bearing in economic relations for obvious reasons that Tony Abbott referred to. Now, India has always sort of prided itself in its trading relations of sort of putting national interest in it. So it's, I don't think nobody would really challenge India for being a free trade champion. I think in this case, it'd be great to hear from the Indian perspective, given on the reliance on armaments towards Russia, which is increasingly a junior partner to India's number one adversary, China. And at the same time, both energy and the broader semiconductor and technology, how does India see it?
Thank you, Kaush. Well, one thing, the phrase that I really liked from Tony Abbott's introductory remarks was that you have to be practical free trader theorists, right? And I think that is where, despite 1991 big liberalization push in India, India has always been very pragmatic. We really haven't opened up at the pace at which I think the world economy would have liked, and you have sensed that in the frustrations that have been repeatedly felt. Even the EU-India, the council that was announced earlier today, India and EU have been trying to get into a free trade agreement for 15 years now. So it just tells you for a democracy, a loud democracy like India, I don't think the policies, the posturing that you hear at political levels are necessarily what you should be watching closely. It's truly the money, it's the actual trade flows, and it's what happens on the ground. There is a lot of resistance on the ground. For instance, even the new, the recent free trade agreement that RCEP, the regional cooperation, this massive agreement, which a very large part of Delhi and I think the business community in India were really batting for, and yet we saw vociferous agitation against it by the agriculture community, the dairy sector, etc., and eventually the government did came in. So that is just how things have been dealt here, not from a philosophical or a theorist view of what free trade or globalization ought to be, but by real political interests on the ground. And while that might have delayed a lot of negotiations and reforms, I would dare say, but I think it's happening in a much more sustainable way. I think that's one distinction and an important part about India's view on free trade. The other is, vis-a-vis China, I do think that, of course, there's the noise, but trade with China has only gotten stronger. In fact, there is a pragmatism to that as well. We do realize that in most of our sectors, particularly if you look at the last 2 years, and India has been producing a very large share of global vaccines, and we depend on China for a lot of the APIs. And what you saw in terms of the supply chain disruptions had a larger global sort of...
Spell out API.
Well, these are active pharmaceutical ingredients that go into the production of drugs, and in this case, vaccines. So I think the Indian view has been quite pragmatic, and the last 2 years have only meant that while on one side the government does ban a lot of Chinese apps and TikTok and other things, but the trade, if you look at the just the volume of trade between the two countries, it is only looking to get stronger and stronger. I think on the defense bit, this is where the whole push of Atmanirbhar Bharat is really self-reliance. It's a Hindi word for self-reliance. And the great push is from the food security perspective, definitely from energy security. India, unlike many other major economies, we have 37% of our energy needs which are imported. And that is a very large number. And that reliance, obviously, it has its own complications. And the third is, of course, the defense, the military sector, where there is a great dependence on Russia and other suppliers. So that, I think, the recognition that Atmanirbhar Bharat has to become a catchphrase. It's like a call for a larger reform within the domestic economy to make as many sectors as possible self-reliant and make in India. You're hearing these phrases repeatedly, but now it's more than a catchphrase. Many sectors are increasingly being driven, even the electric vehicles, the whole, the solar push for moving the energy transition. A lot of these, I think, while there is a philosophy to it, it's extremely pragmatic because at the end of the day, this is an economy that has just come out of poverty. At $2,100 per capita per year, there is a cost to ideology, there's a cost to philosophy, and I think that is where the pragmatism really serves us well.
Well, so I think we've had two sort of very useful generic responses. That luxury is not going to be provided to the remaining three panelists, so we'll have to go. So one of the things, let me go to Stormy and I'll come to you, unless you have a quick intervention. So I'd like to posit this particular question, supply chain. So let's not make this entirely into a trade discussion because I think we have a preponderance of free traders on this panel. The supply chain discussion is very catchy rhetorically. We should do it, we should secure the supply chains, we should onshore it, we should nearshore it, and we should friendshore it. Now I'd like to ask my esteemed panelists, is there one example they can actually point to where that has worked or can be done? And I would say the practicality of it in that implementation of something like this especially for multiple sectors. And then who decides? So back to India's case. Who really decides which part I'm going to be having an onshore and which I'm going to do the French shore, and how you become the French shore, how I become the onshore. I mean, I don't know how that thing is exactly going to work. So I'm going to ask you, what do you think, especially given your trade background, Stormy, to see if you have your thoughts on it.
Yeah, thank you so much. But I do have to start out with a couple of generic comments. Sorry about this. I'm another one of those free traders and rule-based trade supporters. Last year, I had the pleasure of being on the economic resilience panel of the UK's G7 presidency. And before this, I worked as the Business 7 and Business 20 Sherpa. And we discussed, we have been discussing value chains for years. So this is really not a new phenomenon, it's not a new discussion. Business has been starting to diversify, to think about vulnerabilities for really quite a while, since the 2008 to 2011 financial economic crisis, the natural disasters coming afterwards. But it has really, really gained speed, and I would say that the whole debate changed over the last few months, and that we now see more and more people who are discussing trade saying either it is a vulnerability or saying it's an economic weapon, it's a geopolitical instrument. And this is a phrasing or a narrative which I really don't like that much. Or at least out a big part. And whenever I hear trade has not worked, because you hear that a lot now, trade has not worked to change political systems. Yes, it does. It hasn't. Trade has also not worked to completely prevent conflict and war. No, it hasn't. But as you rightly pointed out, it has worked to lift billions of people out of poverty, to increase income worldwide. Actually, in a lot of cases, it came with economic freedom and sometimes even political freedom. And I always take the European Union as the prime example. If there's an example where trade, economic integration, and dependencies have worked, it's the European Union. But having said that, obviously it doesn't work with everybody. And we are, and the international liberal economic order, are facing huge threats. And all three of you pointed these out. It's not just China, it's also Russia, but it also comes from some other autocracies or regimes which are kind of in the middle. And we, and I have to say, I also belong to that group of those neoliberal institutionalists who thought interdependence would always go on forever, institutions would protect us, and this also was not right. So businesses and governments have to think what is in our toolbox to save the global economic liberal order based on values, based on the rule of law. How can we save that while at the same time making us more independent from regimes and autocracies which can help or hold us hostage in critical situations. And I would say first of all, the most important point is nobody can do it alone. That's really important. So any kind of sovereignty, strategic autonomy endeavors, and we talk about this a lot in the European Union, this is not going to...
It's a very popular word in this country.
I'm sure it's also a popular word in the US.
Strategic autonomy is
not strategic
yes.
autonomy,
It's
but
very
decoupling.
important,
But decoupling certainly is.
Yes.
And this is something where, and I really liked what you said, the Trusted Partners Network or initiatives. I'm a little hesitant using a phrase like a new democratic trade order. I would be a little bit more hesitant, but trusted partners, I think, really catches it well. So first point, it can only be done together. Second point is we have to look at where the problem comes from and what we do about it. So we need to think about if we are so dependent with regard to rare earth minerals, for example, or other metals and minerals which go into the green green transition, green technologies, we need to invest in research and development for alternative materials. And we need to invest in recycling. And it's better to do this together than and engage in a race of subsidies and everybody trying to get that production in their own country. So it's definitely an initiative which I think needs to be talked about in a enlarged G7 context. I would also say that we need to talk about environmental technologies for mining, which is really important, and put more effort into this. We definitely need to think about not just diversifying our supply chains, but also holding reserves of particularly critical metals, minerals, but also other products. Again, doing this together, it's awfully complicated.
You'll have a chance to come back to this, but I would again urge not to go. We know all we need to do, this wide agreement. It's how to do it. I think if there are examples of how we can do it, otherwise it becomes increasingly a rhetorical thing. Once we start on a trade, we get to have free democracy, we need to have all the ESG ones in, we should take care of environment, while we are really dealing with hard political points, as it was mentioned here. And so let me phrase this and come back, and you can respond to this, and then I'll jump over to Jeff. The fundamental point, at least in hindsight, in the change through trade was, we'd all become so economically interdependent that we will try to value and prioritize keeping the economic interdependency and minimize the wars that will put this interdependency in jeopardy. That was the theory. And it seems like the democratic countries and the autocratic countries have different motivation, drivers, and maneuverability in this relationship. So certainly the idea that both Russia and China under an autocratic regime sees trade as an extension of, as Tony Abbott mentioned, the political or economic sort of dominance element as opposed to free trade system. And in the short term, this economic interdependency has led to a resiliency issue on the democratic nations, that we cannot really act against Russia because we're energy dependent. And for the autocratic country, they're almost beyond reach in the short term. The long term, of course, you can address it. So in this context, when we go forward to look at new trade deal that we all agree on, in this new economic concept, how exactly we're going to do this? I think that's a quick answer, and I'll jump around and come back to you.
Yeah, no, sure, but the instruments I just pointed out are very concrete, and they are being discussed on the G7, for example, also on the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, and that is something to build on and take also countries on board which might be interested in it. What I have witnessed over and over again, that sometimes it comes down to 2 points why it doesn't work to have the cooperation, and that is mistrust, even among those countries, and a competitive thinking. And I think we need to overcome both of this. In terms of the other point which I would like to mention is we have to put a lot more effort into the WTO and reforms, and with regard to the upcoming ministerial work on trade and environmental issues, trade and health, and fishery subsidies to get that started. And I'm a great fan of plurilateral initiatives in the WTO. I know that not everybody is, but I think this is the way forward, because we have big problems, the countries, the members of the WTO have big problems signing up to multilateral deals, so if that doesn't work, digital initiative and so on. So that's the way forward, but within the WTO, not outside of it, I would say.
Jeb, let me turn over to you. I think the United States in many ways was a very influential voice in the global trading architecture. We've sort of withdrawn from it for some time now, but are big champions of resilient supply chains. As mentioned by Stormy, if you look at the two very functioning and demonstrably high impact integration trade, one is NAFTA, now USMCA, the other one being the EU. So going forward, what are the lessons and thoughts on resilient supply chains from the U.S. perspective?
Well, it's hard to represent the perspectives of U.S. or India. I'll give my perspective, 30 years in and out of business and government working on supply chains, which is, it comes to the question of need, as the former Prime Minister said. But China now makes many of the things that we need. Whole parts of the economy. I saw, working for an aerospace and defense company, I saw over a period of 5 years our dependence for basic electronics that go in our most sensitive military systems, so many of them coming from the PRC. And then Americans saw with COVID, I went into the government to work on the corona response, on the supply chains. And I never imagined I'd be working on trying to find those little vials that we do tests with. Last acquisition I was involved in was syringes to administer vaccine, as well as syringes needed in hospital. $5 billion of syringes, every single one of them made in China. And they're being nice this time. They're shipping out, if we can unload them in our ports. But it may not be like that in the future. So I think the definition of need, it's one thing if China makes things that go into the equivalent of our Walmart. Okay, that's dolls and little things like that, and sportswear. It's another thing if it goes into our auto sector, for example, which is a pillar of our economy, if it's dominated by China, all the underlying components, the networking components, the batteries, the semiconductors, the microelectronics, the communications devices, the rare earth magnets. So what is it going to take? It's going to cost. Because it won't be made at the same scale as it is in China. And it won't be made with the same subsidies that the Chinese government pays by essentially confiscating funds from its population. So it's my belief that like-minded countries are going to continue to embrace free trade, but they're going to be like-minded. They're going to sign up to more or less basic, similar standards. And they're probably going to create a barrier around themselves vis-a-vis China. It's also, some people call it a border adjustment. Someone probably got a poli-sci degree coming up with that phrase. It's also called a tariff, a very unpopular term in sort of our circles, but will be very politically popular. So I believe such a barrier will be around like-minded countries. I think India, the US, Canada, Australia, Korea, Taiwan, UAE, these countries, Mexico, can come together and sign up to basic standards, and they can set it, the governments can set it as a goal with business, that in certain sectors, which are deemed to be very important, that each country is going to incentivize their countries where they apply best. Those incentives will depend on the country. US loves tax incentives. Other countries like subsidies. EU loves regulation. But I believe these are all ways to solve the problem.
I think we Americans like to say we're not going to talk about representative generalities, and then we go ahead and make it that
We're very good at it,
regulations and anything.
I got my degree for that.
But anyway, let me turn over to Christophe. It is one of the fascinating things is the interest towards Indo-Pacific. We had the Quad, we had the Indo-Pacific strategy. We ought to recognize Prime Minister Abe for coming up with the term free and open Indo-Pacific that has been used so broadly and widely. But now we have 20 plus countries with Indo-Pacific strategies, and a whole bunch of them from Europe. So as being a special envoy and ambassador for it, two questions. One is, in the Indo-Pacific strategy, is the idea of supply chains and sort of trading incorporated? If so, how? In individual Indo-Pacific strategies, and then at least in the European context, because you've got EU Indo-Pacific strategy, you've got a German, you've got a French, you have a UK one too, and then have several other countries. Is there any other thought on looking at it collectively, how they're going to address these supply chain discussions, particularly what you heard right now with the TTC and the investment and the GPI and other things that were talked about?
Thank you. First of all, there are only 4 European Indo-Pacific strategies. The French started it in 2018, and Germany and the Netherlands followed in 2020, and now we have an EU strategy, and they're all aligned. I want to be reassuring on that point.
What's our feeling on the UK one?
The UK is not, there's the tilt, right? The tilt. But no, UK is still part geographically of Europe. You know what? I was listening to the previous speakers, and I broadly agree with many things. I think the EU, let's speak of the EU strategy, it would be simpler. What we're trying to balance is exactly what the former Prime Minister described. The need for free trade, but also the need to push back economic coercion, the need to address issues such as reciprocity, and that of course is these 2 issues are paramount when it comes to China. Former Prime Minister quoted the Australia-China trade, but now we have Lithuania, which is subject to economic coercion from China, and this is something that is simply not acceptable. Also, we have to balance the need, which is a political question, as you said, the need for less dependency, reducing dependencies, economic sovereignty also in some sectors, yes, indeed. But when you look at the EU strategy or the German or the French strategy on the Indo-Pacific, you find out that trade is still very prominent. I think 70% of global trade is done between the EU and the Indo-Pacific anyway. And we're going to pursue FTAs. We have opened a negotiation with Australia and New Zealand, which we hope to conclude in the near future. There is this...
We in this is French or?
The European Union, because trade is a EU competence, it's no longer a national competence. We have also restarted the negotiation with India, as you mentioned earlier, which is it's a very interesting one. Will probably take some time, but I look forward to the conclusion of it because it will be a real game changer, I believe. And trade is one thing, and I think it was mentioned by you also, the need for the EU and France and Germany to not to lose sight of the importance of multilateralism and multilateral institutions. This is why in our Indo-Pacific strategy, WTO reform, WHO reform, vaccine access, pharmaceuticals access, and so on, is very, very prominent. And lastly, I think there is also what you mentioned earlier, partnerships. You know, partnerships not only on trade but on supply chains, for instance. This is what we're looking for. If you take the digital economy, all the major providers of the EU, except the US, are in this part of the world, in the Indo-Pacific. So it's very interesting for us to discuss these issues and find digital partnerships with Korea, Taiwan, and with Japan, and with Singapore and others. And of course, it's a high priority for us. And I think that's it.
Well, thanks a lot. I think we've done okay with our time. We got 15 minutes left in the hour, and as opposed to me furthering this conversation, I'll open it up for the audience for questions. I have plenty here, I'll keep going, but it'd be great if people had any questions from the audience. I hope you push us on the supply chain points. Okay, so you raise first, I'll get there. Keep your hands, I can't see all of them, I got, okay, great.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed Abdelwahab. I am from the Egyptian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. My question is you, Mr. Jeffrey. You mentioned that the like-minded countries are going to do their own trade because they are going to have their own terms. But on the other side, we see that other countries in this part of the world, India was not included, but like you see the RCEP also, Shamika mentioned it. They are moving stronger and they are moving faster and they are moving on a large scale. And even if you mentioned Singapore, Japan as part of this trade that they can west with the trade, they are still having dependencies on China and on other parts of the world. And still, this makes the supply chains harder to break. So I would like to hear your take on that.
I'm gonna take a couple of questions and I'll come back. Yes.
Hi, I'm Sam. I'm part of the Raisina Young Fellows Program from Ireland. And this is a question for all the panelists. There is a lot of talk of trade, freer trade, and even practical free trade. What does it all mean?
I'm glad you asked that question. There's one in the back and then I'll come over to you. Oh, you need a mic.
Rajiv Amrasuri from Sri Lanka. Being in the Indian Ocean, there is a lot of emphasis on the Belt and Road Initiative, and that is something which has been policy also is looking at. How does one reconcile the Belt and Road Initiative of China with the several supply chain plans which are discussed now emanating from Europe? Is that clear?
So what about the Belt and Road?
So how does one, basically in the Indian Ocean, the Belt and Road Initiative has got a lot of primacy and importance, especially to the countries in the Indian Ocean.
Yeah.
How does one reconcile the Belt and Road, which is something which is being pushed really hard by China,
Right.
in relation to the other supply chains? Because at the end of the day, you would want one main supply road.
Thanks. Let me take these three, and then we'll come back and put them in a packet of three. We'll go forward till people. So, Jeb, do you want to take the first one? And then
I think we're talking about generational change. This is going to take 20 to 30 years. It won't happen quickly. By the way, the current architecture started, one could count after World War II started with some very practical arrangements, moved on. Trade agreements tended to follow the practice for many decades. Then it began to change. I would say in the 1990s, the agreements often drove the practice. I think we're going to return now once again to a period in which business is moving quickly and moving out. Businesses see risk in their supply chains. They're trying to create dual supply chains. Sometimes they're not decoupling from China, but they're creating an alternative route as well too. So businesses are moving quickly. And governments, I think, in the future will be catching up. So I think the era of regulators, trade negotiators, determining the exact specifics of the architecture, I think that's over. I think business is going to have a much bigger role. And the governments, primarily, their big role will be the kinds of incentives they set. And I think the different types of incentives I talked about with different countries, they're going to meld in very interesting ways. And I think when we're talking about all of these serious countries outside of China, there's very little that they can't do. It'll just cost them more, but they have it well within their capability.
just paraphrase that. It's going to cost more in the short term. In the long term, we really don't know how this is going to work out. So this idea that, it's just going to cost us more, it's not preordained or inevitable. Let me go to my good friend from Ireland's question. I think if you are a non-trade person just listening to even this panel or Ravi, you really don't know trade is a solution to everything, and there are different words to this, and we really don't know what the practical application of this is in a given trade, whether you say the freer trade, more practical trade, more trusted trade, and then at the same time, we're gonna do this onshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring. Whenever that word is used till now, correct me if I'm wrong, in supply chain discussion, it is almost one country decides. If I decide what I'm onshoring, friendshoring, nearshoring, and there are 190 countries, and every one of them decide the same fact, I just know exactly how you come together to do these supply chains that everybody loves to talk about. So the business is doing it. But it'll be interesting to see how all this shapes out. So I'll let any of the free traders respond to the question on how do you do it. Prime Minister Abbott, Stormy?
Well, I think that government loves to overcomplicate and overregulate, and in the end, if I'm business X, my supply chain is all the things that I need to get to produce my product or service, and government is never going to know that without being unbelievably intrusive, but I know that, and it's my patriotic duty, I would say, as for argument's sake an Australian business, not to be dependent upon a country for items in my supply chain which could be turned on and off like a tap if this is the sort of thing, and this is where government might come in, our country is really going to need a readily available supply of. Now, in terms of what is free trade, well, I think it's quite simple. Free trade is no tariffs and no quotas. Freer trade is lower tariffs and fewer quotas. And I guess as things have become more sophisticated, we're not just talking about physical goods, we're talking about services. And so free trade, for instance, in legal services between Britain and Australia, might be that a British lawyer can freely practice in Australia and vice versa. And again, between countries that are broadly like-minded, that have broadly comparable standards, and that accept the rule of law, the freer the trade is at every level, the better for everyone.
And I would love to add a couple of components to it. Business loves rules-based trade, which creates certainty. So, well, I mean, in a certain realm, I mean, at least for a little while, the trade dispute settlement worked pretty well under the WTO. It doesn't right now anymore, but that is something which was of really great importance to the business sector. I mean, we worked, or we advocated for it repeatedly and always again, because it is, if there will always be conflicts, there will always be subsidization, there will always be new tariffs. There will also always be anti-dumping measures, which are not always directed against dumping, but have a hidden agenda. And for that, you need an institution which has an oversight mechanism, which finds these violations, and which offers you a mechanism for absolutely.
But even today,
so
today, the facts are, if we looked at from 2000 to 2020, and you just look at world map of how many of the 190 odd nations traded with the United States and China, you look at the number, and I highly recommend it. Most of these guys here have looked at it. That is almost flipped. So today, majority of the countries in the world have a stronger trade agreement with. This is related to the BRI questions. So I'm posing it that way for. So if majority of countries are dependent on working with China as a main trading partner, including the one that was referred, India was number 3 today earlier, then in that context, how all these nearshoring, foreshoring, and plurilateral agreements are going to work, if they're going to high grade it out to some important sectors and services, leave, like you guys both referred to, that in toy making it may be fine, but in other stuff, the practicality of it is what I think was implied in the BRI discussion in the Indo-Pacific. So if I'm rephrasing it for people who want to take that particular question. Go ahead.
You know, I'm always surprised in almost all these discussions that we do talk about multilateral organizations, set of institutions, rule of law, the Bretton Woods, and yet we don't really talk about the one institution which was also envisioned to be part of this arrangement, which was supposed to be a global central bank. The reason, of course, you've seen the kind of turning in the last 20 years is because there has been massive currency manipulation by China, and most rich countries have been absolutely fine, looking the other way. So I think there's fundamentally something that restructuring needs to happen within the institutions. Right now, they do not have the wherewithal and the capacity to manage, and what you're seeing are political repercussions and lots of tensions. But I do believe that perhaps is the best way forward, that we do need to reform these institutions and sort of get the house in order, and it cannot be left to each
So
country.
just for people to know, the institutions you're referring to are
The WTO to begin with,
Yes,
the World Bank, the IMF,
the Bretton
the
Woods,
IFC,
and
IFC, yes.
okay. Let's take another round of questions.
Kaush?
Sorry, please.
Just on the Belt and Road,
Please,
if I may
please,
just
please.
2
No,
minutes.
no, absolutely.
No, because it's a very important question. The Belt and Road initiative is more about investment in infrastructure, connectivity, the way we call it. And it's probably one of the toughest challenges that we face. This is clearly an area where we are competing with China. And the point is really to provide an alternative offer, but it's not easy, because the offer that could match the Chinese offer should, at the same time, take into account sustainability, environmental and social standards, and also the question of the burden of debt. That this burden itself also should be sustainable for the recipient country. And this challenge can only be addressed at a very large scale. It's not the US alone, or the EU, or India, or Australia. It's all of us. We must pool our resources to address this question in the Pacific, for instance, a region which I know quite well. To address this, because it was your question, to address it also in the Indian Ocean, but we will not be able to do it if we do not pool our resources together. It has to be a collective effort, because what China can offer is sometimes unmatchable.
I think that's a really important part, just to put the Christophe's point, that in the Indo-Pacific, to answer to BRI, because America is not a trading country like China is, amount of percent of GDP that comes in, given services and domestic. China wants to be less trading and more domestic, as you're hearing the decoupling. So to match its trading prowess will really depend on this collective group that Christophe mentioned. And it's absolutely important. And that's the main thing you're hearing, Quad and EU and different versions of Quad. Okay. We've got 2 more rounds of question, and then that'll be wrapping up in another 15 minutes. So you go ahead first.
Sorry, I've been holding my hands for so long. So I will read first and take the advantage. I'm also part of the FGG fellow. I'm from China Independent Journalist. My question is really to have, it's a question for all of you. Can you help me to understand what do you mean exactly by decoupling? Is this a one-way decoupling from China in terms of the supply chain? Or, stop trading with China, also trading it as a market? Is that mutual, or is just one direction? Thank you.
Go ahead, sorry.
Good evening, my name is Diego Llosa. I'm from Peru, also from the AFGG Fellowship. My question is for Prime Minister Abbott. I would like to know your views on China's interest in joining CPTPP, pros, the cons, and the risks. Because as you mentioned, China could have a trade policy focus on a geopolitical perspective. And CPTPP are more countries that share the same values on free trade, global trade. Or is a boycott to the interests of Chinese Taipei on joining the CPTPP. So I would like to know what are your views on this issue. Thank you.
Another question? There are more hands. Any other takers, or we go for this round? Yes, please.
Yeah, Martin, hello. Working for the German government and part of the Raisina Fellows as well. I was a bit surprised by the way the discussion went, actually. Having a panel of 5 or 6 free traders made me a bit think of actually my time of studying. And I thought the debate would have developed a little further toward trade that has to be inclusive, has to be favoring sustainable development, has to include labor standards, and so on and so forth. It was not just mentioned with regard to the Belt and Road Initiative, but I think that the trade policy of the European Union is more and more organized this way. I think that it should be an integral part of free trade agreements. And I'd be interested to know whether, from your point of view, it's just like, I think you said, like, it's the Europeans like regulation. So if it's just regulation or something that can make trade stronger.
Okay, let's take the one behind it and then we'll go ahead.
I seem to remember sort of kind of growing up in the 90s. So I should introduce myself. So Chris, I'm a British diplomat based here in New Delhi, but also part of the program. I seem to remember sort of there was this idea that trade would make us all freer and turn us all into sort of enlightened democracies and all get along. It seems like there's been a real sort of paradigm shift, and I'm sort of interested in the panel's collective experience and thinking sort of over the course of your careers, at what point, if you once believed that, at what point did you stop thinking that, and what was it that had that effect? Thank you.
Okay, well, let's take that one by one. The first question was about decoupling. Who wants to answer that? Okay, so let me just say, I'll start with that, and then hopefully some panelists would come in. So from the Chinese, I think the decoupling is multiple ways, and in particular both directions. So your question was whether it's one direction. I think it's two directions. China has found, at least our understanding, and you correct us because our understanding is just listening to President Xi's speeches. It's exactly a very similar discussion, that it does not want to be so overextended and exposed with a global trading network, which then is susceptible to either sanctions of the kind that you found in 5G and then following from it on the Huawei stuff. And so want to make it a bigger domestic, this circular idea, this idea of dual purposeness within the Chinese economy, and to make it more of a resilient Chinese economy, so it's more dependent domestically and less exposed in export trade. That's on the Chinese side. On sort of the United States side, it is of specific technologies like Jeb mentioned, start off with 5G, Huawei, semiconductors, and then a whole host of intermediate parts in new and emerging technologies. So there's concerns relating to that. So that's just very simplified two versions. The other one was this is just purely on the goods elements of it. And then there was another one on investment. So incoming investment screening, whether it be CFIUS and others, which it started, and then other European nations have looked into it, including here, and talked about it. And now we are having a very active discussion about not only incoming investment screening, but also outgoing investment screening. So that's another. So we haven't delved into too much into this particular issue. I think Tony Abbott did refer to it when he referred to services. So you've got a kind of a discussion going around on goods, you've got discussion going on services, and you also got a discussion going on capital flows as it would go forward. So it's a quite a complex and a rich area. How this all pans out in the eventuality, which is I don't know, But the thing that people often come to miss it, depending on which country you are, that you're only, that country is talking about decoupling. So if you're in America, you really would think that it's largely America discussing decoupling without having as good an appreciation that China and Chinese leaders are actively engaged in the same discussion for somewhat similar purposes on the other side. So anyway, anything folks to add on yes, Jim?
I would say in the U.S., my read is even the most right-wing voices are not talking about total decoupling from China. And they're certainly not talking about decoupling from anyone else. The solutions to the supply chains, whether one is in business or whether one is in the Republican Party or Democratic Party, people are looking to the solutions with partners and allies. So chips are a great example. U.S. passed a CHIPS Act in 2020. It is now considering a major appropriation, $50 billion. But how does the chip industry and how does the U.S. government look at chips, semiconductors? Well, it says, okay, we need a little more capacity in the U.S. than we have. It is vital to protect what is made in Taiwan, the leading producer, vital to protect what's made in Korea. And also the U.S. has a very strong interest in Europe regaining some of its semiconductor capacity, and also looks to Israel for important production. So the solution is not, the solution on semiconductors, which I think is a great example, is not make everything in the U.S. Rather, you can see a wide belt that will be made.
So the guys on the other side, even though we can't see you, we can hear you. So you gotta. Anyways, I think this story it was implied, but it needs to be really made explicit. If people talk about decoupling, it's a selected one, not a whole scale one. I mean, I don't even think it's practical to do a whole scale one. Anything that okay. Let's go to the next point. This was a very technical one, Prime Minister Abbott, for you to figure out.
I'm not sure it was a technical one. It was, should China be allowed to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership? And I think the answer plainly is no, it shouldn't. Because China doesn't play by the rules that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is supposed to play by. Should Taiwan be allowed to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Absolutely it should. Absolutely it should, because they do play by the rules. So the only reason to let China into the TPP would be fear, and the only reason to keep Taiwan out would be fear, and we shouldn't be frightened.
That's a pretty clear answer.
If I may come in on the issue of inclusive trade.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Because I find that extremely important, and that was what I was trying to get at when I started to talk about rules-based trade. Because you're actually not talking about free trade as we did maybe in the early 1990s anymore. But trade has become so much more. It's about environmental issues, it's about labor issues. And we do see that in all of the EU's trade agreement, the Australian trade agreements, the US agreements. There's always a sustainability chapter, and there needs to be one. And it also needs to be part of the WTO with the joint initiatives. And this brings me also to the question, sometimes we are rather slow in signing new free trade agreements in comparison to RCEP, for example. I mean, it was signed much faster. But if you compare these actually do not have the inclusive trade parts, and I think it belongs into it. Still, we need to be a little bit faster with regard to concluding free trade agreements. And on the paradigm shift, I can say that in Germany it started around.
You're going to the fourth question now,
the paradigm shift.
Let me wait on that if you don't
Oh,
mind.
sure, no problem at
Because
all.
I think that you will want the answer from everybody as to who went where. So let me.
Can I disagree strongly? I hate to be difficult, but I strongly disagree.
No, she finished the question. She went to the next answering the fourth question, and since that was posed to everybody, we'll use that for concluding part. So that's
I strongly disagree with this tendency to want trade deals to cover everything under the sun.
Oh, I'm not saying that.
And you know, to give you a practical example, one of the ways that was attempted to be engaged in to sabotage the Australia-UK free trade deal was this completely spurious claim by British farmers that somehow Australian farmers mistreated their animals. Absolute balderdash, complete bollocks, and it was protectionism masquerading as a form of animal welfareism. And I think this is now rampant in the whole free trade area. Australia got nowhere doing free trade discussions for a decade under a former government because they wanted to bring in everything under the sun, including labour standards. Well, you know, if you don't trust the country enough, if you don't trust it not to exploit its labour, you shouldn't do a deal with it. Now, maybe that means you don't do deals with some countries, but the idea that we wouldn't trust the EU, or we wouldn't trust the United States, or we wouldn't trust Japan, or we wouldn't trust India for that matter, to have decent standards, I just think is ridiculous.
So I think this is a very complicated issue. I think if you would come into this, I think this idea of, as you mentioned, that we are talking free traders, and what about all this ESG stuff that you really talked about, and you're not talking enough about it. There is I don't want to take the sides on both sides of the argument, but there is an inherent contradiction, and it hasn't been appropriately and satisfactorily resolved. One side is saying we need to deal with trade now because of these economic dependencies, whether it be on energy or on sensitive matter to China. We really need to take care of it, and we need to build with countries and tell them there's a better way to do it. So that makes an argument sort of cutting transaction to trade in a way that would engage people and build secure, resilient supply chains. The second one is to look for these higher standards in inclusive environment, whatever. Doesn't matter which side you are, but I think everybody would agree that it's a pretty darn tough to reconcile. And you have to choose which one you're prioritizing. And so I'd like to hear how the India's vision is when they hear that kind of stuff, and how would that impact in the conclusion of the hallowed FTA that was announced today with Europe.
No, well, at the end of the day, there is a trade-off. I think that is where words like practical free trade, pragmatism, they're really meant to explain to people that, look, there is always a trade-off between one, financial returns, and the second is when you have social objectives. There is a reason, US, under the pretext of fiduciary duty, finds it very difficult to channel resources towards ESG investments. While Europe has been far more innovative, I think, on that front. So different cultures have different appetite, and we will have to allow for that, but I think the recognition that there is a trade-off, you will have to give up profits, certain amount of profits or returns to really make headway when you're talking ESG. And that's exactly true when you're talking to countries like India as well. Now, the green transition, energy transition, India is a very large part of that global transition. I don't think the world can go about energy transition without India doing it. Now, you have to also appreciate the fact that for $2,100 per capita per year, what you're asking of the country is impossible. So, are we then the trade-off has to be made palatable as well. And that is where I think I completely agree with Tony Abbott on this, that you shouldn't make it so difficult for these trade deals to go through, that they really just go on, negotiations go on for decades. And having said that, let me tell you, and just want to reiterate, India has gained tremendously from trade. Last 30 years, if we brought out 200 million people out of poverty, it is on the back of trade and globalization. So India is one of the net gainers, and therefore always looking for opportunities to strengthen those relationships.
Just one last comment on to add to this. Why do we do it in the EU? Why do we have inclusive trade deals? It's mainly because our public opinions would not accept otherwise the trade deals. And it's also the ratification by the European Parliament. When we ratify the forthcoming trade agreement with Australia, they will want to see whether we have an environmental clause. What are the objectives of climate change? And probably they will be happy if Australia recommits to their already existing objectives. It's not, something that Australia couldn't do, but it's just for us the condition for ratification and for acceptability by our public opinion.
I
This is
agree,
a-
but I mean the flip side of that is
Yeah.
the ratification for India has to do with Indian public opinion and Australian public opinion, and they may be. So anyway, these are complicated issues. The other point I just throw in is that there's certainly rhetorical aspirations, but it'd be always nice to look at what happens to actually doing it. So what happened to saying we're not going to do nuclear? Did it really help, or did the coal imports and exports to Europe go up for it? So talking about ESG in every inclusive agreement, and then buying energy, which really is, in this particular case, driving the war machine of Russia to Ukraine. So I think the discussion between the rhetoric and actual impact and what actions does, every country makes these judgments. And different people look at it both in complexity, in inconsistency, in sort of values, application. So those are all the reasons why that thing comes in and out. Now yes, Jeff.
I think there could be some convergence. Different countries doing and different entities doing different things, however, converging. Let me give an example on batteries. So batteries involve mining, they involve processing minerals, producing battery cells to battery packs. Well, today, 80% of the processing happens in the People's Republic of China. And some of that is done with forced labor. None of that is done with human rights. Much of it is done with coal. Much of it is done violating environmental standards that India, Australia, and the US and Europe would not abide by. So I think we're going to see in different countries, the EU may require a battery label. You have to show the provenance of the entire supply chain. In the US, it may activate a 80-year-old law that says if you use forced labor, you can't import the product into the US. But the result will be shaping a new supply chain.
Okay. Let's talk about ESG, and then think about how to get cobalt out of DRC, where it is, how the great inclusive arguments is going to persuade DRC to sell those cobalts to somebody else than China. I think it's a practical point. It'd be good to have an answer to this rhetorical, aspirational point that we need to really have it. The other flip part is a lot of these industries are in China, particularly rare earth and others, because rare earth processing is inherently very, very environmentally harmful. So do that stuff in Nevada or in Arizona I don't even know whether or in Europe would be really, really hard and expensive. Forget expensive, I don't even know whether you'll be able to do it. So all these things come into play. Any other question before we go back to the question made by a friend from the UK here as to, correct me if I got it right, that in your lifetime, when did you see this shift? Is that the point on free trade?
So I think it's in the context of sort of the consensus that free trade is not going to be the way to bring China into the international community. And I think it's quite striking that seems to sort of now be the consensus view. And I think we saw reference to that in the opening remarks, that von der Leyen's opening remarks earlier as well. So that's really the wider context of the question.
Okay. So I think that's a good one to have a sort of round of sort of concluding thoughts and any suggestion that may have. So before we go that, because that will be concluding, any other? Yes.
Yes, hello. My name is Pierre Penot. I am advisor to the European Union ambassador here in India. So I just want to share and maybe have a view of the panel. This is a more personal opinion, as you know. We diplomats do not express the view of our office. But I was very interested in, especially in the lady, last speaker, explaining that trade deals take years. It's true, but how do you sense in the panel the urgency and how we can solve it when, taking the case of Ukraine, the position of business can be damaged in 2 months. We can take an example of Renault that lose 40% of its customers because the customers are based in Russia. So how can we reconcile the adaptation of the trade agreement at the speed at which it has to be made with the reality and the ground. And maybe the pendant, I thank you, Mr. Moderator, you are wonderful, to supply chain in the sense, when you are a region, but I am expressing the question, how do you solve the issues that if your companies are too international, you lose this customer base. You are dependent, and it's not necessarily I am in charge of technology dependence, but you depend on selling the products. So it's maybe a pendant, Mr. Moderator, to your concept of supply chain. Maybe I'm wrong. So it's a little bit both questions linked to the reality of companies.
Okay.
How is the panel and you, Mr. Moderator, sense it?
Thank you. Over to you, Stormy. Sorry, so when in the moment did you find the question on that China is, the way to engage with China through free trade is probably a bridge too far?
Does anybody want to answer the last question?
Well, I think we're out of time, so this is the part of this. You can answer that question with it. We have already abused, we're past 9 o'clock, so anybody who's doing concluding thought can also answer.
So I think in Germany it started, not just with me personally, but with the Federation of German Industries in 2017, I would say, with lots of companies starting to wake up that the high dependence on China is actually not healthy. It took quite a while, and the BDI took a pivotal role in getting that opinion out there. And it's interesting to take a look at the China paper, which was published, which then went over to the Business Europe, was picked up there and kind of became bigger and bigger, and more companies, also smaller ones, started to think about their value chains. And that intensified with the EU new strategy, strategic autonomy, thinking about anti-coercion instruments. That was something completely unthinkable in the German business community to talk about anti-coercion instruments. And now it is absolutely up at the very top of the thinking that this needs to be done. And the last tipping point, the last learning, really was Russia's war on Ukraine and the invasion. I think this is when really everybody woke up that there are huge dependencies which are very unhealthy.
You feel free to answer the question here from the
I think I'm not the right person to answer.
Well, in the Indian case, I think it's a little simpler because we share a very long disputed border. So I don't think there's one or two episodes that would really be the tipping point. But very recently, the Galwan episode, where the Chinese army did come into parts of Ladakh, etc., in the midst of the pandemic, that did push back relationships, and I think that led to banning of over 50 Chinese apps, etc., etc. But again, I'd like to reiterate that while that is on, and that is definitely, I think, a very high priority for this particular administration, but India wants more and more trade, free trade. India recognizes very well what she's gained in the last 30 years, so including with China. So I think in its core sectors, and pharma is one, the dependence on China, I think there is a will to wean away, but the economic forces right now are too strong. So just, looking for alternate supply chains, not going to happen, immediately. But I think the border dispute remains the gorilla in the room as far as trade relations with China are concerned.
Yep.
Here's several questions. The question about
You can answer anything, your concluding thoughts. So there are. I think there is when did you realize this dog ain't hunting? And
I think for me, already when I was around 17, 18 years old, and I began to see the effects of deindustrialization in the U.S., I had my doubts about what I would call radical free trade. So already it was a long time ago, and I think it came to pass during Corona when I, like many Americans, looked around and said, okay, we make almost nothing. And this is fundamentally a problem, and we need to make with friends instead.
Well, I want want somebody to also answer. I mean, I'll do it, but also a gentleman from the East will go
Well,
ahead.
also the tipping point, I agree with what Annick said, but I would add the pandemic, of course, when we realize the huge dependency we have on the Chinese regarding masks, but also when we realize the kind of behavior, the mask diplomacy, the vaccine diplomacy, the development of coercion and so on. I think it was also a tipping point.
Sir.
I don't think anyone ever thought free trade was going to democratise China. I think we thought that economic liberalisation would eventually lead to political liberalisation, but that's a much broader thing. And the Chinese thought that too. That's why they've stopped it. I mean, political.
So I think either stop with me, let me, I think succinctly the idea of the support home with companies which are both very multilateral. Most customers, at least in the United States, really weren't worried about where it came for as long as the prices were down. And I think that was largely the theme, including iPhone. Who knew there were 44 darn countries into the iPhone? I mean, now you hear it, but nobody who bought it had a sense of it. And similarly, nobody knew that you were going to Walmart and basically buying every toy you did and every gadget you did was a Chinese made. So I think the cost efficiency and the profitability, which went to unprecedented stake in globalization. I mean, I think it's a tremendous example of free trade efficiency in how much the cost was cut because of Chinese engagement. I think now there is not that much pressure. So you have this most bizarre and incongruous inconsistency. On one end, we have the NBA in America, the National Basketball Association, which is almost a champion of Black Lives Matter within the United States. And rightly so, and it's got great leaders talking about it. That same organization goes out of its way to hush up any discussion on Uyghurs because of the Chinese market. So I don't know there's one easy answer on this. It's quite, so when people come up with this ECG and inclusivity, you dig in it, and it's very difficult to find both consistency and impact. So it becomes, plus it is a shadow, so it's an underlying cost. So it becomes more you do, the divergence between the north and south and east and west kind of grows. On China, very quickly, I think there are two ways to look at it. One is the people who actually did it in a programmatic policy, dry world of when people saw it, and then a popular impact of how this really happened. So I think the dry world, whoever were in the, at least in the WTO world, there are two important sort of institutional issues of WTO. One is one country, one vote. It's more like a General Assembly than the way that World Bank and IMF, a weighted store, works. So even if you may be number one country, US or EU, your vote is the same as Liberia or somebody else. As such, having big agreements on tough issues become, the transaction costs become higher and higher. And then the Chinese entry into WTO as a developing country and associated stuff, once you got it in, a lot of people then said that we didn't just let the proverbial fox in the hen house, in this case perhaps the dragon in the hen house. And the rules doesn't allow, because of the institutional structure, to readjust this thing to bring it in, because most of the countries are now trading with China. So if you do, I'm a rule-based entity, and and then we're going to follow it, and we're going to somehow restructure it, and then not entirely sure how. And so then you have the appellate system. And the appellate system has to apply the laws that are there right now, not make new ones. And the analogous thing there is to saying we're going to have it. So the US felt that these laws we don't believe, we cannot fix it, so we're not going to appoint people of the appellate system. And so that is broken. A lot of complaint on the US to say whether this is broken or not. That is somewhat analogous to British judges going off the panel in Hong Kong. If you're going to sit it, you have to apply the Hong Kong rules. If you have a problem, you don't. Whether you buy it or don't buy it, but that's anyway, that's the theory. So that's the, and you saw how do we fix it, that a country that takes developing state in World Bank and the UN and WTO in one side, and the other side says, I'm going to pave the entire world with BRI. And this incongruity just becomes more and more difficult. But the political impact, this was all about among the policymakers. The political impact in the US was Huawei, it was a little bit of Uyghur, it was here the border war, it was the Ukraine issue. That has sort of brought it into the bigger mass. Anyway, I think great discussion, complicated topic. I won't delay it. A big round of applause to the panelists. Have a great day.